Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Battlefield, Pennsylvania. Today we're on location in Braddock, Allegheny County. In 1755, a British army under the command of Major General Edward Braddock was defeated here along the Monongahela River. It was a complete disaster, but a seminal moment in the life of George Washington. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Joining me today to discuss the Battle of Monongahela is David Preston, author and historian, and Bob Messner, founder and director of the Braddock's Battlefield History Center. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, my background is not as a historian. It is as a lawyer for 50 years. In 1994, I became interested in the battle and just was astonished that there was not a history site here to commemorate it. So I decided that I was going to see what I could do about that. I spent the next 20-some years both collecting artifacts, and then I was, at that point, going to create a history center, raised a lot of money, and we finally got it built in what was once a car dealership.
I'm currently a professor of history at the Citadel, where I teach some of our nation's finest young men and women about American history and American military history. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, and I like to say that it's kind of like how the writer William Faulkner said that for every Southern man that it's always July the 3rd, right before Pickett's charge. And I think that for any Western Pennsylvania boy, it's always July 9th, 1755, right after Braddock crosses the river. And so I kind of grew up, visiting historic sites like Fort Necessity, Fort Ligonier, and that was kind of the early seed of my interest in the 18th century. And when I went to graduate school at the College of William and Mary, I found that I really couldn't make sense of early America without reference to its native peoples. And so my initial foray into the 18th century was looking at it more from the native perspective. And that's one of the things that brought me to this project on Braddock's defeat, is that no one had really ever looked at the battle from the perspective of the victors, that is to say the French and the Indians.
What was the relationship like in 1755 between the British and the French?
The British and the French had been at odds with each other for a considerable period of time, particularly in Europe. Now here in North America, both the British and the French had been here since the 1600s, and they really had not had much in the way of hostilities. But that all changes in the 1750s when the French start to build a chain of forts down the Allegheny River. The first was at Fort Le Boeuf up near Lake Erie. The second one was halfway down at Fort Michaud near present-day Franklin. And the third one was at the point in Pittsburgh, Fort Duquesne. This alarms a group down in Virginia known as the Ohio Company of Virginia, who had been granted hundreds of thousands of acres of land here in what is now Western Pennsylvania by their king. Now, whether the king had the right to do that or not is not clear, but they felt that they had this right to land, and it was very important because in those days there were not stocks or bonds. You measured your wealth in land. And so the Ohio Company was very sensitive to what they regarded as a threat to this landholding because of the chain of forts coming down. The Governor Dinwiddie of the Ohio Company of Virginia contacts a young man, a 21-year-old fella by the name of George Washington, who had always hoped of having a career in the British military. And he engages him to take a message up to the French up at Fort Le Boeuf. That message essentially is going to say, stop building this chain of forts down the Allegheny River. Go on back up into New France where you belong because you're on British territory. So Washington starts from Virginia. He works his way up with a friend by the name of Christopher Gist, who later becomes also a significant frontiersman. And they eventually make it here to the Braddock area, where they stay at the trading post of a fellow by the name of John Fraser, Fraser was a gunsmith, and he had previously had a trading post on the Allegheny, upriver a little bit, but he'd been chased out of there by the French when they started building their forts. Washington stays with John Fraser. Then he and Gist work their way up the Allegheny to Fort Le Boeuf. They deliver the message to the commandant of the French. The commandant takes one look at this message from Governor Dinwiddie and pretty much tells Washington what he can do with that piece of paper. Washington is no doubt chagrined by this. He knows that's not the answer and response that Governor Dinwiddie wants. I suspect he also knows what happens to the messenger who brings bad news, which in this case is him. So he and his party start back down along the Allegheny. At one point, partway down, one of Washington's Indians has been turned by the French while up at Le Boeuf, and he fires his musket at Washington, but fortunately misses. Washington and Gist chase the Indian, but don't catch him. They come down a little further down the Allegheny, and at this point, Washington and Gist decide to build a raft to cross the river. Another adventure because Washington manages to fall into the ice-clogged river at that time. Somehow they make it to the other side, and then Washington and Gist come back again to Fraser's cabin here in the Braddock area. And they stay with Fraser both to get warm this time, but also to get dry. Then they go back down to Washington, to Virginia, where at that point they report to Governor Dinwiddie, who is obviously upset. He says to Washington, "George, I want you to take the Virginia militia and go on up and throw the French out of Fort Duquesne." Well, Washington is delighted with this assignment. He had always hoped for a career in the British Army as a soldier, and this is his chance. So he starts up with the Virginia militia, gets as far as a place we now know as Jumonville Glen, where there's a skirmish between Washington and his Virginia militia and a young man by the name of Ensign Jumonville and a party out from Fort Duquesne. There is some question as to whether that party was a scouting party or a diplomatic party. I don't know that I've ever resolved that, but it didn't make a difference because a skirmish breaks out, and as a result of that skirmish, Jumonville is wounded but not killed. I believe that these two young officers are sort of trying to figure out what they're supposed to do next under the rules of continental warfare, and there were such rules, when suddenly one of Washington's Indians gets out of his control, goes over and plants his tomahawk in the head of Jumonville, killing him. Well, this clearly violates any rules that might have existed. One of the party of Jumonville escapes, makes it back to Fort Duquesne, where he tells them this terrible thing that happened out here in the wilderness. At that point, it's a party that comes out from Fort Duquesne seeking revenge for the killing of Jumonville. They are led by a relative of Jumonville, and it's a larger group of French and Indians. Eventually, they get that revenge by soundly defeating Washington and his Virginia militia at the Battle of Fort Necessity. The Battle of Fort Necessity is unusual, and it's a relatively small fort in the middle of a big clearing, and there's a day-long engagement in which Washington and his Virginia militia are soundly defeated. Washington decides if he's going to have anybody to take back to Virginia, that he'd better ask for a surrender, seek a surrender. He does, and in the process executes a document called a Decree of Capitulation. The Decree of Capitulation is fairly generous to Washington and the Virginia militia, but it does contain language in which Washington admits to the assassination of Jumonville. Washington, with his tail between his legs, leads his Virginia militia back down in the direction of Virginia. It is I believe it's one of the bleakest periods of his life. He has surrendered for the first and only time in his life at that battle. And I understand that he was contemplating what to do with the rest of his life, including thinking of farming, which he wasn't looking forward to because he had yet to meet, let alone marry Martha Custis, the wealthy widow. And so his farm was not that impressive. It's at this time, in the depths of despair, that he learns for the first time that the British over in London have started to take seriously this chain of forts down the Allegheny. And this is where his life begins to turn around, because he decides to seek to contact General Braddock to see if he can come along with the first ever British general officer ever in North America. And he does that. Braddock is receptive, and so at that point, Washington begins the Braddock expedition on his part.
I like to begin the story with the year 1748, which is the year in which the last war between Britain and France concluded. And this period between 1748 and 1754 is a very crucial one, and a lot happens in that period that very much propels these empires as well as Indian peoples into open conflict with each other, even though a lot of them didn't necessarily want to be involved in yet another war. In some respects, that period is very much like a truce rather than an actual peace between Britain and France. And we should also remember that strategically, what's at stake here in the Ohio Valley? For the French, the entire purpose of their empire in America in the 18th century is containment. Containment of the much more numerous and expansive British colonists in America. And what the French began to see in the 1740s was an influx of British traders heading out into the Ohio Valley. And the real threat there is that through trade, which is means economic as well as military alliance, the British could potentially draw some of the Indian allies of New France into their orbit. And that is part of the rationale, the necessity really, of the French moving into the Ohio Valley with incredible military force to remedy this situation. I like to point out that when the French first send an expedition to the shores of Lake Erie to begin this construction of outposts in the Ohio Valley, they send about 2,600 men, which is slightly larger than Braddock's entire army in 1755. But this is a really monumental show of force, and it really reflects the seriousness with which the French governor in Canada, the Marquis Duquesne, is taking this situation, and how a lot of local individuals, whether it be Ohio Company agents or a royal governor of Virginia or the governor general of New France, are escalating things locally, even while the governments back in London and Paris are not necessarily happy about these developments, even though they end up supporting them.
We say the French had effective control of this region after Fort Necessity, and that's sort of a mixed idea. Could we talk about how they or why they felt they had control of this region?
There's a forgotten moment, I think, in the telling of the story of the French and the British conflict for the Ohio Valley, and that's April of 1754, when the French, again with a large force of about 600 militia, Canadian militia, as well as Marines and artillery, come down the Allegheny River, and they come to the forks of the Ohio, and they seize a very small Virginia fort or stockade called Trent's Fort. And the British had established that fort as a trading post, as a seed for a much larger fort eventually. But the French come with such monumental force of arms that the small Virginia garrison of about 40 individuals capitulates immediately. And it's important that the French make this conquest bloodlessly. Had had the post commander, Ensign Ward, resisted in any way, had there been bloodshed, the French would have been seen as the aggressors in the conflict. But because it was a bloodless conquest of the forks of the Ohio, we often tend to see Washington skirmish with Jumonville a month later in 1754 as kind of the initial spark that ignites what becomes the 7 Years' War. It's also important context for understanding Washington's perception of events and the nature of the threat in the Ohio Valley when he's coming over the mountains in the year 1754.
Can we talk a little bit about Edward Braddock? Who was he in the years leading up to this? What was his background like?
Edward Braddock had spent his lifetime as a member of the elite Coldstream Guards. His father had done the same thing before him. He was a 60-year-old person. His previous assignment had been as the commandant of the post at Gibraltar in Spain. We believe that he had fought in battles in Europe, but we don't have any particular indication that he had led troops in battle. That said, Braddock's reputation initially was probably worse than deserved. A lot of historical scholars these days feel that Braddock was no better nor no worse than any other member of the British general force. That's because in order to become a general in those days, you had to do things strictly by the book. Unfortunately for Braddock and others, the book contained nothing about the types of situations that Braddock encountered here. And a lot of historians believe that any other general, British general of the times, would have handled the matter pretty much the same as Braddock did. As you may know, in Europe, where most of these people had their experience, it was traditional to line up your forces on this side and the other side's forces on this side and fire until people started falling. Well, in part that may have been due to the fact that muskets were used at this time. And anybody who knows a musket knows that it has no rifling in the barrel. And the ball can come rattling down the barrel at unusual directions at the time, and they were very inaccurate, particularly beyond a short distance. And so that was what they were trained to do. They were trained to stand fast. The book that they were supposed to follow was by Sir Humphrey Bland, excuse me. And that book contained nothing, even years later, about what to deal with in the guerrilla situation that Braddock encountered. David, do you have any more about Braddock?
I think this is a great question. It's a basic one, but who was Edward Braddock? This is a question that many historians and biographers have not really asked or answered in a kind of objective or neutral way. We've tended to accept old stories about Braddock that were told much later after his death, or even in the 19th century, and very little effort has been made to research what we can about his early life. So, for example, there are plenteous records in the British National Archives about General Braddock's command in Gibraltar right before he came to America. And it turns out that he acquitted himself quite well in his command of Gibraltar. He was not only the lieutenant governor of the fortification, but also the commandant of the garrison. This was one of the most important British posts in its empire at that time, and Braddock was praised from all quarters, from civilians. Reports of his good conduct also reach the British ministry, and these are indeed some of the reasons why he was selected as the commander-in-chief of this expedition to America in 1754. I should also add that when you look at Braddock's command at Gibraltar and the time that he spends there in 1753 and 54, he gains immense experience in siege, fortifications, and warfare. He also gains experience in a very multi-ethnic place that requires knowledge of other cultures. And these are precisely the types of things that he was being expected to do in America in 1754 and 5, to besiege these French forts out in the Ohio Valley, and also by royal order to negotiate with native peoples and to gain their support and alliance for the British Empire.
A lot of this story that happens here begins in Virginia, Alexandria. Could we talk about what happened in Alexandria?
Well, when I left off, we had Washington returning there in disgrace, and then he learns for the first time that this General Braddock is going to arrive from England, the first ever general officer in North America. By this time, Washington has concluded that there's something he doesn't know about the military, and he hopes to be able to learn by associating with this first ever British general officer. So he makes an attempt, and it's successful, to contact General Braddock to see if he can accompany him on his mission. However, there is a problem with rank. Washington is very sensitive to the difference in rank between the British and the colonial troops, which would in his case make any junior officer of the British regulars superior to him as a colonial officer. Braddock and Washington worked this out by Braddock telling him to come along as a member of the general's personal staff without rank. Washington has no rank in this, but as a member of the general's personal staff, he can deliver the general's orders, but he doesn't have to take them from anybody but the general. Having overcome that, the expedition starts out, and it is an incredibly long and difficult expedition. There were a lot of bad assumptions made when they planned this over in England. For example, they thought the land between Alexandria and the forks of the Ohio was flat to gently rolling land. We know it's the Appalachian Mountains. They also gave him 2 regiments of British regular troops. However, those were of the so-called Irish establishment, which had not been treated well by the British military establishment. And when Braddock gets there, he has to put drafts on other units, both there and in the colonies, to try to bring them up to shape. And even then, he's not pleased with what he sees as soldiers. For that reason, among others, he stays for about a month halfway up at Fort Cumberland until he's able to get these troops into what he feels is adequate shape to take them forward into battle. Now, another assumption was that somebody knew where the heck they were going. My suspicion is all that they told General Braddock was to leave from Alexandria and go in a general northwesterly direction until he ran into the rivers. I don't know that for a fact, but that's my suspicion. There really were no good maps of this period, and in addition to that, they had to have a road. There was no road, and so they had to build their own road. And the reason they had to do that was that the job that Braddock had been given was to go first from Alexandria to capture Fort Duquesne, then to go up to Fort Niagara, then across the top of Pennsylvania, the bottom of New York, over to Crown Point near Fort Ticonderoga. So this was an enormous assignment. The distance as the crow flies between Alexandria and Duquesne, Fort Duquesne, is approximately 250 miles. When you add on the trip to Niagara and then going across to Crown Point, it was an enormously long trip. Well, we know there were no stores along the way, so he had to have wagons. And that becomes a whole big problem because he puts out ads saying, please sell your wagons to General Braddock and your teams at a fair and reasonable price. And he gets no reaction to that at all. So at that point, it's a crisis for Braddock. He mentions this to Benjamin Franklin at a meeting they have in Frederick. Franklin, being a cagey guy even at his younger years, suggests that he adds something to the bottom of that broadside or poster, and it says basically, if you do not sell them to him at a fair and reasonable price, his quartermaster, John St. Clair, will visit you. John St. Clair, the hussar, will visit you. Well, the people who occupied most of the land in question were the so-called Pennsylvania Deutsch, or Pennsylvania Dutch. And St. Clair and Franklin knew that the words the hussar would make an impression on them, because in the old country, the hussars had come and confiscated their farms, their crops, their equipment, everything they had before most of the Pennsylvania Deutsch moved over here. So that causes more than 100 teams and wagons to become available to Braddock. Some of them are not in the greatest condition of the horses, but he's a lot better off than he was before that. But that means he has to have a 12-foot wide road to accommodate the wagons and the cannons that he's bringing to blow apart Fort Duquesne. So that's some of the things that Braddock encountered that he probably should not have had to.
The Alexandria Congress that you asked about was actually a very important moment politically in British colonial history. Braddock had been ordered to call a meeting with some of the key concerned royal governors who were going to be part of this larger British military effort in 1755. It's important to know that the British government had actually approved 4 separate military expeditions against French fortifications all across the frontiers of North America, from Fort Beauséjour in Nova Scotia all the way down to Fort Duquesne. And part of the Alexandria Congress's purpose was to coordinate these 4 separate expeditions. The other 2 being not Sir William Johnson but at this point, but William Johnson's expedition against Crown Point and Governor William Shirley's campaign against Fort Niagara. The Alexandria Congress discussed really the tempo of the campaign in 1755. By tempo, I mean when these 4 separate expeditions were going to arrive at their targets. In Braddock's mind, he expected to be at Fort Duquesne in early July, and he does his level best to overcome all sorts of logistical and geographical obstacles that we've heard about, and he is the only one of the 4 who arrives on time. The rest of them are basically stillborn. The other thing, interestingly, that the Alexandria Congress raises is the issue of imperial governance. This was the very first time in British colonial history that a general officer of Braddock's stature had been appointed as commander-in-chief of all British forces in the colonies. And Braddock did have significant powers. And so it raised the whole issue of the colony's relationship to the crown. One example of that would be funding. Who is funding Braddock's expedition? The British government expected the colonial governments to contribute sums to what was called a common fund. And this was one of the things that Braddock discussed with the royal governors at Alexandria. The governors had to alert Braddock to the reality of the colonial governments, that they basically told him that the assemblies are going to balk at this. They're not going to contribute a lot of funds to your coffers, essentially. And so there's a lot of, from the very beginning of Braddock's expedition, there is a lot of friction that's seen between not only Braddock and colonial governments, but also between regulars and the provincial troops that they are participating in these campaigns with.
Could we talk about who's waiting for Braddock here in and around Fort Duquesne. If we were at Fort Duquesne in 1755, what would we have seen?
In 1754 and 55, the French commandant at Fort Duquesne was a veteran French officer named Captain Claude Pierre Pécaudie de Contrecoeur. His lineage in New France goes all the way back to the 1660s. He was a veteran French officer who had been stationed all across New France. And that experience gave Contrecoeur knowledge of native peoples and their diplomatic customs. Contrecoeur cooperates militarily with natives at times. And Contrecoeur, remember, is the officer who led in April of 1754 that bloodless takeover of Trent's Fort at the forks of the Ohio. So Contrecoeur at that time would have been considered one of the finest French-Canadian officers who had taken this very, very important strategic location. Having said that, Contrecoeur was very cognizant of the weaknesses of the French forts in the Ohio Valley. They were logistically on a very, very thin lifeline. And in fact, a lot of the French correspondence is heavily weighted towards all the logistical problems. You know, getting men, ammunition, supplies 700 miles from Montreal down to Fort Duquesne. So the French have their own issues logistically, as well as Braddock with his challenge of getting his army across the mountains. The total French garrison, I might add, usually hovers around 250, and that's honestly all that the French could sustain for any lengthy period of time. Now that changes, of course, in the summer of 1755. In a really remarkable miracle of timing, where the French achieved a concentration of force, not only among the Canadian militia and Marines, but also at least 20 different Indian nations or communities that will send warriors here to the Ohio Valley, and they begin to arrive in May and June of 1755.
I think that's important. Can we talk about that? These warriors aren't necessarily locals, but transplants. So where do they come from?
The numbers and the origins of the Indian warriors who fought at Braddock's defeat, where the Monongahela this was one of the key questions I wanted to answer in my research. In my research, I was able to document about 20 different Indian nations or communities that contributed to Braddock's defeat in 1755. And these native peoples were drawn from literally half the continent. I'd probably summarize it like this. About 1/3 of the native forces were from the St. Lawrence Valley. And these were nations like the Ganawage Mohawks, Abenakis, other groups that historically been staunch French allies, as well as Roman Catholics, often living in mission communities. Another strong component of the Native coalition came from the Great Lakes region. Nations like the Ottawas, the Chippewas, also the Wyandots around Detroit, that area, and then rounding out this coalition were Native nations that were more local, Delawares, Shawnees, Mingos, who had gravitated to the French orbit. This is a remarkable concentration of Native warriors. On the day of the battle, French records indicate that there were anywhere from 600 to 700 Native warriors. Natives composed 2/3 of the force that attacks Braddock on July 9th. And as I like to say, they deserve 2/3 of the credit for the victory.
A study was done in 2001 by the National Historian of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, about all of the Indian wars in American history. In that study, Braddock's defeat, or the Battle of the Monongahela, ranks second in terms of the casualties inflicted by the Indians on the other side. That's one of the reasons why what happens here is important. This is the second greatest Indian victory. Now, people should understand that Custer's defeat is not number one. It is something called the Battle of the Wabash out on the Ohio-Indiana border. In this type of ranking, Custer's defeat is down at number 10. We have charts here at the Braddock's Battlefield History Center listing all the top 40 Indian victories. One of the things that's surprising is that most of these Indian victories occur here in the East and not in Hollywood's fictionalized version of the West. So that's important. Now, David also mentioned the importance of timing. And both the fact that the Braddock expedition got there when it did and not earlier or later could have made all the difference. Because if they had gotten there earlier, many of these 650 Indians might not have been there. If they had got there later, substantially later, the Indians were not about to stand around and wait for a long time, and they may have gone back to their villages. So it was just a matter of bad timing, in addition to everything else that resulted in the disaster that occurred.
Now, Braddock's march from Virginia is almost as legendary as the battle itself. So could we maybe very quickly hit the high points of some of the challenges of Braddock's march, where he went, what he did when he was there?
I think I'd like to start with just the remarks of British officers who were part of this march, where they were creating a well-engineered wagon road capable of transporting 12-pound, 6-pound artillery pieces, 8-inch howitzers through essentially raw mountains. And there was one British officer in particular who had, I had done some research on his previous campaigns, and it turns out that he had fought in the Highlands of Scotland in the 1740s, similar type of rugged country. But in his writings on Braddock's campaign, he essentially says that we have never faced anything like this. And many British officers comment on how different this type of expedition is, this type of warfare. They certainly perceive what they're doing as different. And it really is an incredible achievement to carve a wagon road across those rugged mountains. At times, as Bob has already indicated, Braddock's campaign came very close to just logistical failure. Not enough horses, not enough wagons. And that's part of the reason that Braddock decides to split his army in mid-June of 1755 and proceed with a lighter and leaner flying column so that he can arrive all the more quickly at Fort Duquesne. Now, I have to add here that for all of the romance about Braddock's march, there's a parallel effort on the part of the French. And that involves a French officer by the name of Captain Daniel-Marie Hyacinthe Léonard de Beaujeu. He is the officer who will command the forces that will fight Braddock on July 9th. But in April of 1755, Beaujeu is tasked with leading convoys of French and native reinforcements and supplies 700 miles from Montreal down to Fort Duquesne. And they arrive literally about a week before the battle. So, again, another example of timing. If they were a week later, different story.
I think in order to really get a feel for the difficulties of the Braddock Road and the people who came across it, we previously mentioned that there were a substantial number, sometimes up as many as 100 people, out in front with saws and with axes to create this 12-foot wide road. But the other thing that grabs me, the fact that this was the Appalachian Mountains. When you think of taking wagons with horses up one side of the mountain, that's bad enough. And taking a 6-pounder cannon up one side of the mountain, that's bad enough. But think about when you get to the top and you've got to come down the other side and hope that it doesn't roll over you on the way down. The accomplishment, I figure that this is one of the great logistical accomplishments of history. And I did spend a couple years doing logistical work in Korea, so I know at least some of the modern challenges, but this was incredible what they did.
And I think if Braddock had won and captured Fort Duquesne, that we would hail him as this modern-day Hannibal who had conducted this great march across the mountains and just overcome all the obstacles.
So Braddock makes an incredible journey. His men are probably pretty exhausted, and he still has to fight. That brings us to the place we sit today. Could we talk about the Battle of the Monongahela?
So on July 9th, 1755, Braddock's army is on the cusp of victory, and that feeling is very palpable. The French and the Indians have failed in their efforts to halt or delay the British advance across the mountains. In fact, the French had kind of labored under the assumption that there's no way that the British could ever get artillery pieces across the mountains. And so when Braddock finally arrives in the Monongahela Valley, the French are really, they recognize that this is the moment of confrontation. From General Braddock's perspective, he plans to invest Fort Duquesne on July the 10th. The July 9th events are very challenging nonetheless. He fords the Monongahela River 2 times, and this is a moment in which all of the British commanders seem to have expected the French to try some type of ambush at a point when the army is vulnerable, at a river crossing. And so when these 2 river crossings are uncontested, General Braddock resumes his march towards his next encampment. And there is a belief, and some British officers even expressed this, that they expected to hear Fort Duquesne exploding in the distance as the French recognize that the game is up and that they need to withdraw rather than be destroyed by siege artillery, which could easily have been accomplished by Braddock's guns. So the army, after the second crossing of the Monongahela, deploys again into the line of march, the organization that has successfully gotten this army across the mountains, successfully defended it from previous French and Indian reconnaissance and small attacks. And there's a sense again that victory is here, and that it just requires them to tighten the noose on Fort Duquesne. Bob?
Well, I guess that's the point at which contact is made. There are different versions of how that contact comes about, and it's not all that easy to reconcile them. There are a couple problems that David has run into and that I've run into in trying to get some of the details, because as we know, the Indians have no written history, and they are the major player in this victory. So we get very little help from them. We have good accounts from the British and from the colonials. Professor Paul Copperman had helped us to sort those out many years ago. On the other hand, there is not a contemporaneous French account. There is an account written about a year later by Dumas, who was the second in command to Bugeaud. I can't do the French that my friend can, but when Bugeaud was killed with one of the first volleys, Dumas claimed that he stepped forward and took things under control. I am somewhat troubled by the fact that it's not contemporaneous It's a year later, and because he felt he was not getting adequate credit for the battle. I don't know that there is any one person who led the battle. I think David and I are not on the same page in that regard. I think particularly since the Indians are the victorious side, that each of these different Indian nations would have had their own battle leader. And what they did in this case of going down both sides of the column was standard practice for them. I find myself unable to definitely say who was the leader of the victorious forces. By the way, if I could just mention one other thing, I don't want to forget my friend George Washington, who we left back down in Virginia after the disaster of Fort Necessity, and he hooks on with the Braddock expedition, and he's coming up this way. Unfortunately, he develops one of the real great cases of dysentery. He is unable to ride on his horse without pillows, even though he's one of the most famous horsemen in Virginia. And Braddock eventually tells him to stay behind. But Washington makes Braddock promise that he will call Washington forward before the final engagement, which Braddock does. But in the middle of this battle that occurs, Washington performs so brilliantly, or he's either very stupid or very brave. But he is riding up and down this column, and remember, there are 90% casualties among the British officers, so he's one of the few things left that even looks like an officer, although he had no official rank. And he has holes through his tricorn hat. He has holes through his coat. He has several horses shot from under him, and nothing happens to him personally. And that becomes important because it starts his legend. He went from the depths of the defeat and surrender at Fort Necessity to being the only good thing from a colonial point of view that comes out of this engagement. And the reason that I feel that's important is that this is the last significant military engagement that he participates in before he shows up 20 years later at the Continental Congress seeking to become the commanding officer of the Revolution. Now, there were other things that go into that decision, but this is his primary military criterion.
Why were the British so ineffective in this battle? Was it really resting on the Indians' fighting tactics?
I think so. Just to go back to the initial French and Indian attack for a moment, the new document, the new French account that I discovered, dated 1755 at the Archives de Calvados in Normandy, it provides a really clear glimpse of French tactics from the moment that they leave Fort Duquesne up until the moment that they make contact with the British. And I agree with Bob. I think that there was an overall commander, certainly, and that was Captain Beaujeu. But command was certainly more diffused, certainly among Indian peoples. I do believe that a lot of the decisions to send the Indians onto the flanks of Braddock's column, those things were discussed in advance. The French and the Indians had 2 months in which to discuss how they might have to deal with attacking this army. So on the day of the battle, according to one British return, there are 1,469 effectives, and that probably is a number that includes civilians and teamsters. The total French and Indian force is a little over 900. And again, as I mentioned earlier, 2/3 of that force is composed of French and Indians. It's important to know that the French and the Indians, they seized the initiative in this battle from the very moment, from the first fire. And part of the reason that the British are never able to recover is simply that this is a battle that the British themselves have no experience with whatsoever. There's nothing in their toolbox that they can pull out and say, this is how we have to deal with a French and Indian attack. So the way I like to say it is that as General Braddock is trying to find out what's happening at the head of his column, as he hears gunfire up at the front, native warriors are already spreading along his flanks, aiming towards the rear, where they know that they can inflict panic and casualties on the baggage train. And that's precisely what they do. So the British are never able to recover any type of real initiative in this battle.
How does this battle end?
Well, not well for General Braddock. After a 3-hour battle, the general is wounded near the very end of it. He is placed in a cart and taken all the way back to the vicinity of Fort Necessity, to what was known as Dunbar's camp. He dies there. His body is buried in the middle of the road. They drive wagons and horses over it so that the Indians will not know that it's a grave and won't desecrate the body. So that's how it ends for General Braddock. What is left of the Braddock expedition is led by George Washington. He sort of leads the remnant back down the way they came, including the double crossing of the Monongahela. It's a long journey. A lot of it is made at night. Washington's own journal and his own later recollections talk about how terrible it was in the dark and hearing these moans and screams, but they were not pursued once they got to the other side of the river. So it was simply finding their way back.
It's really staggering too, just the scale of casualties at the Monongahela, and also the fact that this, as we learned before, this very confident and effective force really is brought to the brink of dissolution in the space of 3 to 4 hours. And even after having written a book about that subject, I still marvel at how quickly this force of British and American soldiers really disintegrates into essentially a mob. Of the 1,469 that crossed the Monongahela, according to this one British return, 976 become casualties in that 4-hour space of time. And it's really one of the most shocking battles that takes place in colonial American history, because of the expectations that this army of regulars with siege artillery would easily accomplish the job against a handful of French and Indians.
What should the ultimate legacy of this battle be? Why is this so important for American history?
I think unquestionably it's the most important battle in North American history before 1775, which is to say Lexington and Concord. More so than Fort Necessity, it's Braddock's defeat that very much escalates the war in North America, and eventually, by extension, the rest of the world. This is a battle that swings the momentum decisively to the French and the Indian side. And part of the reason for that is that the French capture entirely Braddock's artillery. And in subsequent years, they actually use that artillery to pound other British outposts into oblivion. The British headquarters papers of General Braddock are also captured, and this becomes a diplomatic and propaganda coup for the French, because what it shows is that the British were planning these military expeditions against New France in a time of actual peace between the two crowns. And so it makes the British seem like the absolute aggressors, which they were in this case. It's also the story of the beginnings of an American identity. The forces that performed with the greatest military effectiveness at the Monongahela were actually the American provincial units. And there is a sense of difference that you start to see emerging among the colonial or provincials vis-a-vis the British regulars. And so it's important in that regard too, that there is this dialogue that's happening about what is different about Americans versus the British in 1755?
From my point of view, I think I may have alluded to this earlier, but there are three reasons why this is important. I've mentioned that this is the second greatest Indian victory in American history. The second was that the alumni of this battle, the people who fight here under General Braddock, go on to distinguished and famous careers in colonial America. And the third one, and most important one, is what happens to George Washington. This is where he turns his life around from being so down after the defeat at Fort Necessity to coming out of this with an enhanced reputation. And that, for me, that is the main reason why what happens here is important, because it is a tragedy what happens to the people he's with.
I like to say that Braddock's defeat is really the best thing that happens to George Washington during the war, because of how it elevates him to this heroic status. I mean, even British officers praise his conduct during the battle.
On that note, I'd like to thank my guests for joining us today. As always, if you have questions about today's episode or recommendations for future episodes, please visit our website at pcntv.com. For everyone here at Battlefield, Pennsylvania, I'm Brady Kreitzer saying so long.